to invest in. And so here's a photo of me, clean shaven and well dressed. And I certainly don't look like that as we speak. But just very quickly, a little bit about myself. I am the business development manager at New Direction Trust Company. And over many, many years, have worked with and assisted numerous people with using retirement funds and getting them into real estate investments and other alternative type investments. And for 5 years, I actually owned and operated a company called Diverse Retirement Solutions, where we just focused on self-directed retirement plans. And with time, I ended up joining New Direction Trust. They were just a bigger company, more capital, more resources, and we sort of merged my company in with theirs. And Alicia, to your point, I'm knowledgeable about self-directed investing because I've been doing it personally for 14 years. So before I made it a career, this was something that I've been doing for the past 14 years. And so I have boots on the ground experience. I've actually done the investing and been the guy, filling out the forms and doing the things needed to go ahead and make these investments happen. And so today, we're going to be talking about some general concepts. And one of the general concepts we're going to be talking about is the idea of obviously what is a self-directed IRA, but more importantly, why somebody might consider, making this a piece of their overall wealth strategy. And so one of the things that I like to share with people and talk to people about is this idea of diversity. And I think when we talk about diversity, most of us have worked with a financial advisor, somebody in the financial industry, and we're very familiar with the idea of portfolio diversity. And right now in this environment, I imagine a lot of you are shifting and maybe moving stuff to cash or moving to some more conservative assets. And that is most definitely a type of diversity that you're going to take a look at, throughout your lifetime. And one of the things, for the most part, for the vast majority of Americans, this portfolio diversity is really focused on publicly traded securities. So you can certainly get a wide variety of diversity from publicly traded securities, but there's this other area, this whole other, area where people can invest that typically isn't available, especially in retirement accounts. And I like to bring up a different kind of diversity, one that I like to refer to as non-correlated. So a non-correlated investment is one that's not really directly tied to the stock market. And so it's one that can perform with or without the benefit of the stock market going up or down. And so we are seeing right now a lot of people taking a look at precious metals as an example. They're buying gold and silver. Tax liens happen to be something I've invested in personally, and it's an interesting investment where the interest rate is guaranteed by whatever state you're investing in, but it has no correlation to the stock market. And Alicia, I wanted to throw this one back to you. Real estate's a really big, broad category of investment. But I know that even in times like this, there's some real estate that certainly is correlated to the stock market and some that, really isn't correlated. And I know you were telling me about an interesting investment that you had involving hospitality, which you would think would be a pretty awful investment right now since there's no travel. But I was wondering if you could kind of share that concept or idea of how this real estate could actually work in this environment.
Yeah, so some of the investors on the line are familiar with our Lodging Enterprises portfolio that we acquired in November. And so where, a lot of these hospitality, especially anything Class A hospitality, is sitting in the negatives. We bought this portfolio not because it was hospitality. We bought it because of the railroad contracts. So we have contracts with Union Pacific, BNSF, CP, et cetera, guaranteeing whether they use it or not, a set amount of room. So right now, where most hospitality is sitting empty, we're at 60+% occupancy. Now, there's always risk that somebody could walk in with, the COVID-19 right now, but with it really just being utilized by the railroad crew, and as we've seen, distributed goods internally are on the rise. Freight is railroad is the number one carrier of freight. It's been a nice play with the volatility in the market, but specifically because of those contracts. So we got into a hospitality portfolio because of the security around the contracts, not with the idea that travel is always there.
Yeah, I just think it's interesting. Certainly some real estate would be correlated to the stock market, but then there's certainly some that wouldn't have correlation. If you happen to have commercial real estate involved in the healthcare industry, clearly that's a huge need. And so it's just the idea or the concept that you can take those retirement funds and actually get those out of those publicly traded securities, or at least get a portion of your retirement invested into assets that maybe provide you some protection from the ups and downs of the stock market, and their returns work a little bit independently or not as directly to how the stock market is doing. And so I did want to talk just a tiny bit about why these alternative assets or the non-publicly traded securities are not real commonly invested in, especially in retirement portfolios. And I think the latest data I took a look at is that about 97% of retirement plans, whether that's IRAs or 401ks, are invested in public securities. There's a small percent, like 3%, that are invested in what are known as alternative assets. And I would say that for the large part, it's just kind of a system issue. And what I mean by a system issue is that most retirement plans, and I would like employer plans, 401ks in particular, there's sort of a system in place and things follow the system. And it's not necessarily that you can't invest in these alternative assets or that even a financial planner wouldn't want you to invest in them, but it's kind of out of the box. It doesn't really fit within the system that's been set up. So one of the system issues has to do with valuation. And so the example I like to share with people is that if you wanted to buy, let's just say like a single family rental property with your retirement plan, one of the challenges for a custodian, a company like us who offer retirement plans, is that we are legally required to report the value of that asset once a year. Well, clearly, if you have a stock or a mutual fund, it's all automated. You can click a button and we know exactly what that's worth. A computer can do all that valuation. A piece of real estate's a little different. The value can go up or down depending on the environment that it's in. And so it requires a little more work to value. And some custodians, it's a kind of a hassle. They don't want to deal with it. Another thing that we see is that the typical relationship when there's a financial advisor involved is this idea of assets under management. And so a financial advisor wants to get paid for their services. And so sometimes when we go outside of the offerings that they're able to offer, there's an issue with them being paid for their services. And Alicia, I'm just curious, I know you work with quite a few folks on the financial advising side. Does that still work? Are they able to work with you and still get their credit for their services?
It depends. It depends on the structure of the firm. If they're under a custodian like Charles Schwab, no. If they're more like a family office or a fee structured type of financial advisor, yes. However, I've seen, some financial advisors go a little above and beyond for their client. They're never allowed to sell away, but if their client comes to them and says, hey, I just like your opinion on this, they're allowed to give that opinion. And what they've seen from that is, even though maybe they're not getting paid the commission on getting them into one of their investments, building that strong trusted relationship has grown, and eventually they have a longer term type of client with them. So they definitely are allowed to offer their expertise. They just can't sell away. So, but family offices and more kind of private wealth managers that aren't necessarily chained to a big conglomerate custodian, yeah, we're able to work with those guys.
Okay. No, and that's good to know. And I know that it gets a little bit tricky. because sometimes, an advisor can get paid and sometimes they don't, depending on, like you said, their situation. And the other has to do with fiduciary risk. And so I know financial advisors, they actually have a lot on their plate, and they have certain code of ethics and new rules that have come into place that they really have to be conservative in some instances. And it's not that it's their personal choice. A lot of times it's, legislation that's pushed upon them. And the truth of the matter is publicly traded securities, for the very fact that they're publicly traded, are a safer bet for the advisor. Not necessarily that they're better, but just from being in a conservative standpoint, it's just a safer alternative for them. And so that's why we don't see a whole lot of these alternative assets, especially in retirement plans. And so let's kind of jump into the idea or the concept of a self-directed IRA. And what I find is that people have heard the term but aren't overly familiar with exactly what it is. And I just wanted to point out that the word self-directed really is a marketing term. It's not a kind of retirement plan. And so you'll see in just a little bit that there's a lot of different retirement plans that can be quote unquote self-directed. But the idea here is that what a self-directed IRA does is it opens up the possibility of investing in assets that are not the publicly traded securities. So you can still invest in publicly traded securities. This just opens up a wider variety of assets that you can invest in. And so just as a quick example, we kind of divide these plans into two. You're familiar with these plans, but we divide them up into individual plans. So whether that's a traditional or Roth IRA or even health savings accounts, believe it or not, can be self-directed. And then we have employer plans. So we have SEP and simple IRAs, and then we even have 401k plans that can be self-directed. And so the idea behind a self-directed IRA is that you can invest in things like physical precious metals, where you're buying physical gold and silver. You can invest in real estate. You can lend money out of those plans. It opens up a wider variety of opportunities for somebody. Today, we're going to focus obviously a little bit more on real estate. I just want to make sure everyone knows that IRAs have been around for about 45 years. And never in that time period did the IRS say that you could not invest in real estate. But for the reasons we addressed earlier, it's not an easy type of asset for a financial company to value or offer. And so the vast majority of people that are offering these retirement plans, they don't want to offer that as an offering. And so you just want to make sure you're dealing with a trustee that, gives that as an offering. Clearly, New Direction Trust does that. But the idea or concept here is that the IRS basically says, yeah, you can invest in it. We don't have any issues with it as long as you meet a few basic guidelines. And so within real estate, this is actually a very short list, but the IRS doesn't tell us, by us, I mean the American people, what kind of real estate you can invest in. And so you can see here, whether it's single family, multifamily, commercial, apartments, condominiums, it could actually be raw land, it could be new construction. There's really are no limitations on what kind of real estate you can invest in. Really, the only limitations the IRS puts on somebody is oftentimes who you're investing with. And we'll get into that in just a little bit. So it's just fascinating how many opportunities are out there and how many opportunities your retirement funds could be working in. And so just as a kind of a quick breakdown, your IRA or retirement plan can participate in a real estate investment in quite a few different ways. One way is that it can actually hold title. So if you were just curious, you could go to a local county assessor's website and just type in the word IRA, And I think you'd be surprised to find that there's a fair number of properties that are owned by retirement plans. And those are oftentimes, especially in those kind of searches, single family type properties that maybe are rental properties. The IRA can partner with either an individual or another entity and do what's known as tenants in common. So it's still on title, but it's just in partnership with somebody else. So as an example, you could partner your IRA with yourself, believe it or not, and buy a piece of real estate. An indirect way to invest in real estate is that you can actually essentially be the bank. You could make a loan to a borrower, and the real estate could be collateral. And then the final way, and this is typically when we work with Vucoda, this is typically how this works, is that the IRA isn't actually buying the real estate directly, but what the IRA is doing is it's actually investing with somebody who's in turn investing in real estate. And we actually see that quite often. I would say over half of the real estate transactions we see are really fall under this guideline. And so one of the things I like to discuss and talk about when I'm dealing with somebody that's new to this concept is the idea that you have some choice, and that a lot of times people hear the word self-directed IRA and they think that there's just one type of self-directed plan that they can be working with, but just want to make sure people are aware that there's options available. So we saw earlier that you have different kinds of IRAs, whether it's a traditional or a Roth. So when I say self-directed IRA, keep in mind that it's any kind of IRA. But then there's also this solo 401k. And we're going to talk a little bit about sometimes where that might be beneficial for somebody to use that versus an IRA. But this is an important conversation I like to have with people up front because depending on what you're investing in, the right plan up front makes a difference. So let's talk a little bit about a self-directed IRA and how that is set up. This is probably a more traditional type of setup where when you set up this plan, we do the bookkeeping and we will take a look at the various transactions that are happening. So for example, if Alicia has a client that wants to use retirement funds, we'll get those subscription documents from Vucoda. We'll look at those documents. We'll make sure that it's titled correctly because we want to make sure it's the IRA that's listed as the investor. And because we are doing this, we do charge transaction fees because a human being has to touch it and look at it and make sure that it's being set up correctly. So one of the things to be aware of is that depending on the kind of investment you're getting in or involving your retirement funds in, there may be something known as UBIT. And we're going to talk a little bit more about that in just a few slides, but UBIT's unrelated business income tax. And I just think this is an important thing for people to know prior to getting involved in an investment is there a chance that there might be a tax even though you're using retirement funds? And I just want to make sure people are aware that there is that possibility. And that comes up when there's leverage being used. In this situation, we are the ones that hold the actual funds. And so those funds, the cash sits with us until it's deployed into whatever investment you direct us to set that up in. Now, a solo 401k, this is a corporate retirement plan, but this was a little bit differently, and it will have one key advantage, but some of the differences are, in this situation, you're doing your own bookkeeping or we can do it. You actually have a choice. If we're doing the bookkeeping, we'll obviously be charging some fees because that means we have to look at any investments and any transactions that are going on. But if you're doing the bookkeeping, obviously we don't have those fees because we're not doing the work. So the interesting thing with the solo 401k is that it is not subject to this UBIT tax when there's leverage involved. And I know with a lot of real estate investments, this sometimes is very advantageous. The funds, if you're the one doing the bookkeeping, are actually held at a bank of your choice and you have checkbook control. And the one thing that I would say is that there's a somewhat higher risk with this kind of a plan only because there's not as much oversight. And to set one of these plans up, there does need to be a business entity in place. And this would be something that when we sit down and talk with somebody, or now we're talking over the phone, we would walk through that to see if they qualify or have a business that would work for this setup. And so wanted to talk a little bit about this UBIT, this unrelated business income tax. And Alicia, I'm going to kind of bring this back over to you. A lot of the investments that Vukoto is involved in, you're using leverage, especially for your real estate investments. Is that fair to say?
Correct.
Okay. Whenever there is leverage being used, and it doesn't necessarily have to be leverage that the IRA takes on directly. If they're investing in a company that's using leverage, UBIT could occur. And so the way this works is, at the end of the year, if there's net income over $1,000, there's a chance that there might be a little bit of UBIT tax that is due. And this gets a little bit tricky and a little bit in the weeds, because typically we have to look at an investment and decide what percentage of the investment is mortgaged versus what percentage is equity. And so it's based on a percentage of debt versus equity, so to speak. In general, what we find is that on an annual basis, there's not a lot of UBIT tax that comes up or is due. And the reason why is, with these real estate investments, we have a lot of times depreciation, a lot of expenses that come up that offset income. And a lot of this expense is paper expense. So depreciation being the prime example, where it helps to offset that income. Where we do sometimes see more UBIT is when a property is bought and a period of time has gone by, and then later on this property goes up in value, and maybe we've had some significant appreciation. When that property is sold, if there was leverage in place, there can be a tax similar to that capital gains tax on the financed portion. And so I just think it's important for people to know, just to be aware that even though you're using retirement funds and you wouldn't necessarily expect to be paying a tax, there's a chance that that could come up. So the important thing that I like to point out is that this is true for IRAs, but not for these 401k plans. And so a lot of times when Alicia will send me somebody, if somebody's eligible for a 401k, and we know that there's leverage involved, we'll like to put them in that vehicle so we don't even have to worry about this UBIT tax. But this is the kind of information that is a little bit higher level that I think is important for people before they get involved in investments, because the worst thing, or the thing we don't want to have happen, is somebody invests and then a year or two or three later they discover, I have this tax that's due, and they kind of blindsides them. So I like to just address it and talk about it right up front. So a self-directed retirement account, really it works just like any other account that you would set up. It's just a matter of setting up the account, which can be done online, and that account is funded. And most often that's funded through a transfer or a rollover from an existing account. So somebody already has an IRA with another custodian, or maybe they have an old 401k, and it's just a matter of moving those funds over. And it's important to know that when those funds are moved over, we'll do it in a way that it doesn't create a taxable event. So we definitely want to make sure that it's moved over as a transfer or a custodian to custodian rollover. And then really it's just a matter of acquiring those assets. And Alicia, you wanted me to discuss and talk about the fact that when a client sets up a self-directed account, there's some involvement that needs to happen from the client. And the word self-directed is actually very true, from the sense that we don't provide financial advice. We never tell anybody what investment they're going to invest in. It's almost always the opposite. The individual that opens an account with us already knows what they want to invest in, and they're directing us to go ahead and make that investment. But what's important to know is that it's not a passive type of retirement plan. It's one that we do need your involvement because you're the one directing us to make this investment. So that you will be involved in some of the paperwork process and some of the things that are going on. And legally, uh, we cannot fill out the paperwork for people. And Alicia, I imagine you're in the same boat. You can't legally sign off on paperwork. Is that accurate?
Accurate. Yeah, we really rely on our investors to, implement the information themselves, and then we can help and assist along the way. But it's really a partnership. We're partnering with the investor, and the investor's partnering with the self-directed IRA company, and we just need everybody to be accountable.
Yeah, and there's one story I like to share, and this isn't meant to scare people, but the reason I share this particular story and the reason it's important that the client be involved is that, unfortunately, there is fraud, and there are people that have learned these systems and how to take advantage of some of these setups. And so I was talking to a gentleman recently whose mother she had a self-directed IRA account, and the company that they were working with worked by facsimile. And so you were able to send in a fax, and the fax, basically you could send in paperwork that said, I want to invest in this specific asset, and here's how much money I want to invest, and here are the wiring instructions. And so unfortunately, this was pure fraud. Somebody got a hold of this individual's account number, submitted the appropriate paperwork through fax, everything was signed off on, and $150,000 was wired out of this individual's account. And so it's things like this and the security and the fraud that has led New Direction Trust to move to a purely DocuSign system. And so the idea or the intent of the systems we use is to prevent this fraud and abuse. We want to make certain that you, the client, are the one initiating this investment, and there are ways that when the DocuSign is being done, it authenticates it's you that's actually filling out the paperwork. And so it's important that you're involved in that process because we just want to make sure that it's you that, who's getting that done. So we talked a little bit earlier about funding the account. Most people use a transfer or a rollover, but obviously you can do those annual contributions. And depending on whether it's an IRA or 401k, obviously you can make some contributions into that account, just like you can the normal IRA that you're familiar with. It's the exact same account type, even though it happens to be self-directed. And so one of the things I do like to make sure people are aware of is that if you are using retirement funds to make an investment, titling is important. And I know, Alicia, when you're working with folks, this is probably something you're going to double check as well. But if it's your IRA making the investment, we want to make sure that it's the IRA that's listed as the investor. And so this is part of what we do when we're looking at these investments is we are checking for proper titling. The bottom line here is that if it's retirement money that's making the investment, we want it to be clear that it's the IRA or 401k that's listed as the investor. It is actually a separate and unique entity from you as an individual. And so the other idea is that the IRA is the one making the investment. So it's putting in the initial funds. It's also going to receive the income. And so just want to make sure people understand that if it's the IRA making the investment, as distributions happen, those distributions need to go back to the IRA. Once those funds are back in the IRA, then it's totally up to you whether you're doing required minimum distributions or you're just wanting to take distributions. You can then take those out, but you can't circumvent the process and have distributions sent to you directly. And a little bit earlier, we had talked about the idea that it's pretty unlimited what kind of real estate investments you can get involved in. The IRS doesn't say hardly anything about what kind of real estate you can invest in, but what they are concerned with is who you're investing with. And so when you're using retirement funds, there are what are known as disqualified persons. And you, the IRA owner, you are a disqualified person. And so what that means is uh, if you were to go out and make an investment, and here's a classic example. We'll have people who call in at least once a week. And the question will go something like this. I've found a property. My son or daughter is about ready to go off to college, and we would like to buy the rental property in the town where they're going to school. And we're wondering if we can do this with our IRA. And the answer, unfortunately, is no. And the reason why is sons and daughters are considered disqualified persons. And so they're getting a benefit from staying in that property. So in general, when we're using IRA funds, there's kind of an arm's length transaction between your IRA money and you and some of your blood related family members. And so one of the reasons we love working with groups like Vukota Capital Management is that it's very rare that anything like this would come up. They're typically totally separate, generally not related by family. And so we very rarely see any issue with making investments through a third-party firm like Vukota. So just kind of an idea of timetable, and these middle parts probably won't apply so much, but opening up an account really only takes about 1 day. Getting funds moved varies, and a lot of times it varies depending on the custodian we're working with. But I would say it's fair to say 1 to 2 weeks is more common, but it can sometimes take longer. And the reason it can sometimes take longer is that there are still institutions out there who, when we send out a request to move money from another retirement account, they literally force us to use wet papers, original forms that we have to send in the mail. Not many of those left, but every now and then we run into institutions that kind of do the old school snail mail type setting or situation. The good news is that once the funds are in the account, we're typically able to turn an investment around in about 3 business days. So what that means is, let's say Vukota has a project that you're wanting to invest in. You'll complete the paperwork that they have on their side. We have some internal paperwork on our side where basically you're directing us to make the investment. When we have all the paperwork in place, ready to go, we'll take it, we'll look at it, and within 2 to 3 business days, typically, we'll be able to have funds sent so that that investment is funded. Alrighty, so that kind of wraps up just some of the basics about the self-directed retirement plans.
Yeah, thanks, Chris. I just want to give a little disclaimer. I already see one question in the chat window, but attendees, if you have questions, now is the time to ask. You can also reach out to Chris, obviously, through his email, which is listed here. But one question, Chris, is I'm curious whether rental income has to stay within the IRA, and how does accounting work using cash flow from the property to spend on expenses, water, gardening, and capital projects, roof, driveway?
Yeah, that's a great question. So when we're talking about rental properties, the cash flow does need to at least initially stay within the IRA. And so there's a couple of different ways that that can be handled. One is that you can hire property management. And so typically the lease, the agreement is actually between the tenant and the property manager. And then it's the property manager who will be the go-between as far as the actual funds. So as rental income comes in, property manager sends that off to the IRA. And then they usually hold some funds aside in reserve for the typical expenses that do come up. But let's say it's kind of the flip side, and I'll give a couple of examples, but it's perfectly fine if somebody who's using retirement funds buys a rental. They can serve as their own property manager as long as they don't take any kind of payment. And so they can certainly advertise, collect rents, and make sure that those rents go directly to the IRA. So when it comes to collecting rents, as an example, we can handle that in one of two ways. The tenant can send an old-fashioned snail mail check in, and they can either send it directly to us, or you can actually collect that check. We just want to make sure that check is made out to the IRA and not you as an individual, and then you can forward it on to us. Most people, what we're finding is happening is we have an online tool where we can collect payments electronically. So what most people are doing is they're directing their tenants to go to our online portal, and there's a ACH transfer that gets set up. So all the tenant needs is a bank account that they can link to the IRA owner's account. And in that situation, the money gets paid directly to the IRA. If there are expenses, there's a couple of different ways that expenses can be paid. So let's just say, for example, it's kind of an emergency situation. The plumbing, there's a backup, and so you have to have a plumber come out. It's after hours, and sometimes they want payment now, right? So as we sit here today, and this will be coming soon, there's a couple ways that you can take care of that. One is that you can have a third party actually pay for that, and then you reimburse them. Not the most efficient way, but it's a way or an alternative that you can make a quick payment. But what's coming shortly, and we're actually in the midst of working on this with the bank as we speak, is that we're going to have a way of creating what will look like to the plumber a credit card. So we will have a way of generating what will look just like a credit card number or a debit card number, where you can actually charge expenses directly to the IRA account in those situations where we need money like right now. So technology is catching up to where we're going to be able to do that here in the short future. If the money's not needed immediately, you do what's known as just a check request. And so you go online, and we have a way of basically you submit any kind of a payment that needs to be made. So maybe the plumber's fine just having a check sent, and we'll cut a check and send that out to the plumber. So I hope that answers the question. But if the only other thing I could think of is that if the individual's collecting rental income and they are actually wanting some of that rental income personally, that can happen. But the key is that the money first needs to go to the IRA, and then once it's there, then you can take distributions out from the IRA, but you don't want to intercept that money before it makes it to the IRA. So hopefully that answers that question.
It looks like we have another question. Where on the K-1 can one find an indication of income subject to UBIT? If it is not explicitly shown, how can it be calculated?
Great question. So one of the things I'd love to do, Alicia, and if you could save that individual's contact information, or we'd have a way to get back to them. We have an in-house accountant at New Direction Trust, and there is a specific box or line item on the K-1 that tells you that it may be subject to UBIT. And I can get back to you with that answer. And off the top of my head, I don't want to say anything that wouldn't be accurate, but there is a specific way that you can tell. So let's just say, for example, you get a K-1, there was leverage involved. So what needs to happen then is a couple of things. Number one is the first thing we would look at is what is the amount of income that's reported on the K-1. If the amount of income is more than $1,000, then there might be UBIT. If it's less than $1,000, then you don't need to worry about it. So what happens then is that we just need to know what percentage of the project was leveraged versus what percentage is equity. Because to pay the tax, there's a calculation that we do based on the percentage that was leveraged versus that which is equity. So just as an example, let's say on your K1, you show positive net income of $5,000. And let's just say for simple math, whatever the project you're invested in, it turns out that there's a 75-25% ratio. In other words, 25% of the project is equity, 75% is the mortgage portion. The UBIT tax is calculated on the mortgage portion, or the 75%. And so the entire amount of the income is not subject to UBIT. It's only the debt financed portion. And I will follow up with where on the K1 and how you would know. I'll follow up on that one with you, Alicia, if that's okay. And then if you
Yep.
want, you can forward that on.
Yep. We have another question. What is the benefit in using a self-directed IRA purchasing properties over the regular real estate transactions?
This is actually a great question. And the truth is it's a matter of debate, because there are pluses and minuses on both sides. And the absolute number one reason I think people come to us and want to invest in real estate, it isn't the tax advantages, it's not some of these other, I guess, considerations. It's the fact that it's real estate, that it's a hard asset, it's one that they have confidence in, and they like the investment. So, but let me give you some of the negatives of investing in real estate using retirement funds. For people that are used to investing in real estate on the personal side, sometimes the reason you're investing is that there's some really good tax advantages. So for example, there may be depreciation or accelerated depreciation where you're offsetting some income. You don't get to take that within a retirement plan. And it gets a little bit tricky and a little bit in the weeds. When there is leverage being used, you actually do get to use some of the depreciation and some of the expenses based on that leveraged amount. So I don't want to get too much into the weeds, but in general, some of the tax benefits, the write-offs that real estate provides, you don't get within the retirement plan. On the other hand, some of the advantages to you using that retirement plan are that the income coming in, especially when there's no debt leverage, is either tax-free or tax deferred. So I'll use the example, I own a little rental property in Colorado, and I own it in my Roth IRA. And because I own it in the Roth, the income that comes in is tax-free. I've already paid my taxes on that. The other thing that's really nice in this situation is, because it's in that Roth IRA and I have no leverage on this property, I'm not worried about selling the property and having capital gains or any depreciation recapture. One of the nice things about that retirement plan is I could sell that property, and whatever gain I have just stays within the Roth IRA. I don't pay capital gains tax. I don't have any depreciation recapture or anything like that. So that's a plus. And I don't even have to think about a 1031 if I don't want to. I can just take those gains and reinvest somewhere else if I want. But there are some advantages. So hopefully that answers that question. And what I tell people is, if you're investing in real estate and the primary reason you're investing is for the tax advantages, a lot of times retirement plans aren't the best vehicle. If you're investing in real estate because you believe it's a good investment, you like the security of real estate, you like the returns, the retirement plan can be a great investment vehicle.
Well, thanks, Chris. That was super informative. You know, to the people who participated today, thank you for joining us. I really find Chris to be such a pleasure to work with. If anything, he's great for some additional knowledge if you have questions over your current plans. We got one more question,
Sure.
and then we'll wrap it up after this question. So thanks. So if I already owned a property somewhere under individual name, can I simply transfer the title into a self-directed IRA account?
That's a great question. And unfortunately, the answer is no. And the IRS considers that self-dealing. And the question we get is well, what if I buy it at fair market value? You know, I'm not necessarily cutting my IRA a deal, so to speak. And the IRS has just drawn a line in the sand that you cannot buy or sell in between yourself personally or your retirement plan. So the reverse is true also, where if you owned a property in an IRA, you couldn't buy it back personally later on, although you could do what's known as a distribution and take over ownership if you're willing to pay the taxes and treat it as a distribution. But no, unfortunately, can't buy personal investments and put it into the IRA.
Well, great. Again, everybody, please reach out to Chris if you have any questions. He's great. He's very informative. He's super fun to connect with. His email is listed here, ctanner@ndtco.com. And also, if anybody has any questions with VCM currently on any existing investments or any upcoming investments, please reach out. My email is amiller@vcmgam.com. We are rebranding to VCM Global Asset Manager, so you'll see that change in the next couple of weeks. But Chris, thank you so much for sharing your knowledge today and connecting with our audience. We really, really appreciate it. We get a ton of questions on self-directed IRAs, so this was super helpful.
You are most welcome. I appreciate the opportunity, and I look forward to helping anybody that would like to, investigate using retirement funds for, investments with you guys.
Great. All right, everyone. Well, have a good rest of your day and reach out if you have any questions. Thank you so much.